In 1937, there was a children's book published called The Hobbit. It was written by a fellow of Pembroke College, Oxford, for his children. It was about Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit of Hobbiton in the Shire, about his quest against a dragon, his search for a ring. And then out of that children's story, a whole invented world grew, a world of hobbits who are between 2 and 4 feet high and have hair on their feet. Dwarves, elves, wizards, trolls and nasty orcs, men who lived much longer than we do and who acted much more heroically even when they were being wicked. In fact, the men of today are probably more like hobbits. And this search for a magic ring became a whole 3-volume novel. A novel not written for children, though children, if they have the wit and strength, may get what they can from it. A novel written as a history, with 100 pages of appendices, a whole scholarly apparatus behind it. A novel that took 14 years to write and 3 to revise. Well, I myself think that a work of imagination of this order must reflect the fears, the desires, the moral ideas of the man who created it. Professor Tolkien did create it. And do you agree?
Yes and no. They must arise, but there is a vital distinction, I think, between what one is primarily trying to do and what eventually happened.
Make it. You say there's a vital distinction.
Yes, well, you're obliged, any author I imagine is obliged to call on his stock, private stock.
Is this another word for what Freud would call the unconscious?
No.
No, I didn't think it was.
No, both. What is himself, both, no doubt, what he inherits in his unconscious and what he has as part of his mental make-up and reading, his memory. But he may not have the object of revealing that or lecturing to anybody or even trying to put forward his view as a total one or a good one.
Let's avoid the word lecture for a moment, because it suggests a propagandist work, and I don't think anybody is really talking about that.
Well, they have been, so perhaps...
well, I'm not, and you're not, so let's not.
No, good.
But let's then accept the fact that out of this stock you invent the world, and this stock does include a stock of ideas about how worlds ought to be. No?
No. Because I don't believe that there is any one recipe at any one time.
You don't yourself make out a recipe for personal behavior. You don't believe you yourself ought to live in a certain sort of way.
Ah, well, but I thought you were talking about worlds, when I thought you were thought to fact, for instance, that a lot of kings and obviously the hereditary principle is a strong thing. And so on, but...
well, let's be plain. For instance, in this particular world that you have invented, the hereditary principle is very strong.
Yes.
Though not ubiquitous. The hobbits don't have one, don't they?
No, quite so, no.
But do you yourself look back on a world in which the hereditary principle is strong with affection?
I do, yes, obviously. But Rework is also very much easier, one very much, well, I find it very much easier to one in which, out of which to make a story.
And you're only concerned with making a story?
It was my primary concern, which I started out with.
And you took 14 years to make the story?
Quite so, yes.
And this was a story in...
But that is partly out of the fact that I'm a meticulous sort of bloke. And that I took 14 years, not for the general things it is now, but finding time schemes and getting everything right and so on.
Well, for instance, this whole matter of the appendices, 100 pages, language, social customs, history. Normally, if you had been writing a history as a historian, all these would have existed on a card index before you ever began to write.
Yeah.
Is this true for the
Lord
of the Rings?
So, yes. One thing that, for instance, in the remarks you made at the beginning was the fact that time passed and the hobbits grew into this world.
Yes.
In fact, what really happened was that because having already constructed the world, they became drawn into it.
The world was constructed like a model aeroplane?
No, but it existed in posse and in a large scale plan before The Hobbit was written. The Hobbit was in fact originally an attempt to write something outside it and grew into it.
So that you had literally invented the world before you even wrote The Hobbit?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Why?
Why, I don't think so. I could not really think why one wishes to create a thing like that.
Well, then, all right, how? What started it? There must have been a point at which quite suddenly like God, you chose to make the world like that.
I was going to use that illustration. I thought I'd use that. Because, as I've said elsewhere, I think that if you wish to push me back into what semi-theological or philosophical back, I think because being made by a creator, one of our natural factors is wishing to create. But since we aren't creators, we have to sub-create. Let's say we have to rearrange the primary material in some particular form, which pleases us, which it isn't necessarily a moral pleasing, it's partly an aesthetic pleasing.
Then you make this distinction between what pleases aesthetically because it's balanced and what pleases morally. God, we may assume, made a moral rather than an aesthetic choice. Is this too great an assumption?
It's one that required a very long time to debate, but I should have thought that we are dealing with something which we're only looking at facets of one whole, but certainly an aesthetic whole is surely. An aesthetic facet is as strongly to be predicated as a moral one.
In this world that you yourself have made, the complexities that exist mostly, it seems to me, outside the creatures of the world. There is an absolute evil and there is an idea of absolute good. Would you agree? Mordor, after all, is a principle of absolute evil.
I don't believe in absolute evil, but I do believe in absolute good. Yeah. Let's say...
If you don't believe in absolute evil, why did you create the Dark Lord, who seems to be the apotheosis of it?
Well, you said in the book that he himself was not evil to begin with.
He fell. Then, like Lucifer.
Yeah.
So you're...
Well, he's several stages down from Lucifer.
You do believe, then, that there can be a state of absolute good from which most people do fall.
It said, for instance, there's no religion in the book. There isn't, for reasons which are partly aesthetic, partly auctorial, and partly the history. This book, so-called Lord of the Rings, comes at the end of a long series of stories I've created in which the situation would be explained. Why there were no, for instance, churches, rituals, and temples, and so on.
If you were to be remembered as the man who has made the Lord of the Rings, would you rather be remembered as a man who has said something or as a man who has made something?
I don't think you can distinguish. The made thing, unless it says something, won't be remembered.